The Western Philosophy, Chapter 8, Spencer, page 442 to 447. The second section, Biology and Psychology. In a footnote to his essay on progress, Spencer candidly confesses that his ideas of evolution were based on Lamarck's theory of the transmissibility of acquired characters, and were not merely an anticipation of Darwin, whose essential idea was the theory of natural selection. He is rather the philosopher of Lamarckianism than that the philosopher of Darwinism. He was almost 40 when The Origin of Species appeared, and at 40, one's categories are hardened into immutability. Aside from lesser difficulties, like the failure to reconcile his illuminating principle that reproduction decreases as development advances, with such facts as the higher rate of reproduction in civilized Europe as compared with savage peoples. The major defects of his biological theory are his reliance on Lamarck and his failure to find a dynamic conception of life. When he confesses that life cannot be conceived in physical chemical terms, the admission is fatal to his formula of evolution, to his definition of life, and to the coherence of the synthetic philosophy. The secret of life might better have been sought in the power of mind to adjust external to internal relations than in the almost passive adjustment of the organism to the environment. On Spencer's premises, complete adaptation would be death. The volume on psychology formulate rather than inform what we knew is reshaped into an almost barbarously complex terminology which obscures where it should clarify. The reader, so fatigued with formulas and definitions and questionable reductions of psychological facts to neural structures, that he may fail to observe that the origin of mind and consciousness is left quite unexplained. It is true that Spencer tries to cover up this gaping chasm in his system of thought by arguing that mind is the subjective accompaniment of nerve processes evolved mechanically somehow out of the primeval nebula, but why there should be this subjective accompaniment in addition to the neural mechanism, he does not say. And that, of course, is just the point of all psychology, magnificent as the sociology is. Its 2,000 pages give many an opening for attack. Running through it is Spencer's usual assumption that evolution and progress are synonymous, whereas it may well be that evolution will give to insects and bacteria the final victory in their relentless war with man. It is not quite evident that the industrial state is either more pacific or more moral than the militant feudalism that preceded. Athens' most destructive wars came long after her feudal lords had yielded power to a commercial bourgeoisie, and the countries of modern Europe seem to make war with bleak indifference as to whether they are industrial or not. Industrial imperialism may be as militaristic as land hungry dynasties. The most militaristic of modern states was one of the two leading industrial nations of the world. Further, the rapid industrial development of Germany seems to have been aided rather than impeded by state control of certain phases of transport and trade. Socialism is obviously a development not of militarism, but of industrialism. Spencer wrote at a time when the comparative isolation of England made her pacifist in Europe, and when her supremacy in commerce and industry made her a firm believer in free trade. He would have been shocked had he lived to see how readily the free trade theory would disappear along with the commercial and industrial supremacy, and how the pacifism would disappear as soon as Germany assault on Belgium threatened English isolation. And of course, Spence exaggerated the virtues of the industrial regime. He was almost blind to the brutal exploitation that flourished in England before the state interfered to mitigate it. All that he could see in the middle of our century, especially in England, was a degree of individual freedom greater than ever before existed. No wonder that Nietzsche reacted in disgust from industrialism and exaggerated in his turn the virtues of the military life. The analogy of the social organism would have driven Spencer into state socialism, and his logic being more powerful than his feelings. For state socialism represents, in a far higher degree than a laissez-faire society, the integration of the heterogeneous by the stick of his own formula, Spencer would have been compelled to acclaim Germany as the most highly evolved of modern states. He tried to meet this point by arguing that heterogeneity involves the freedom of the parts, and that such freedom implies a minimum of government. But this is quite a different note than that which we heard in coherent heterogeneity in the human body. Integration and evolution leave rather, the testimony is that higher wages commonly result only in more extravagant living or in drinking to greater excess. The joyful wisdom sect, little freedom to the parts. Spencer implies that in a society, consciousness exists only in the parts, while in the body, consciousness exists only in the whole. But social consciousness, consciousness of the interests and the processes of the group, is as centralized in society as personal consciousness is in the individual. Very few of us have any sense of the state. Spencer helped to save us from a regimental state, socialism, but only by the sacrifice of his consistency and his logic, and only by individualistic exaggerations. We must remember that Spencer was caught between two eras, that his political thinking had been formed in the days of laissez faire and under the influence of Adam Smith, while his later years was lived in a period when England was struggling to correct by social control the abuses of her industrial regime. He never tired of reiterating his arguments against state interference. He objected to state financed education or to governmental protection of citizens against fraudulent finance. At one time, he argued that even the management of war should be a private and not a state concern. He wished, as Wells put it, to raise public shiftlessness to the dignity of a national policy, he carried his MSS to the printer himself, having too little confidence in a government institution to entrust them to the post office. He was a man of intense individuality, irritable, insistent on being let alone, and every new act of legislation seemed to him an invasion of his personal liberty. He could not understand Benjamin Kidd's argument that since natural selection operates more and more upon groups in class and international competition and less upon individuals, a widening application of the family principle whereby the weak are aided by the strong is indispensable for the maintenance of group unity and power. Why a state should protect its citizens from unsocial physical strength and refusing protection against unsocial economic strength is a point which Spence ignores. He scorned as childish the analogy of government and citizen with parent and child. But the real analogy is with brother helping brother. His politics were more Darwinian than his biology. But enough of these criticisms. Let us turn back to the man again and see in fairer perspective the greatness of his work. Collier in Royce. Conclusion. First, principles made Spencer almost at once the most famous philosopher of his time. It was soon translated into most of the languages of Europe, even in Russia, where it had to face and defeat a government prosecution. He was accepted as the philosophic exponent of the spirit of the age. And not only did his influence pass everywhere into the thought of Europe, but it strongly affected the realistic movement in literature and art. In 1869, he was astounded to find that first principles had been adopted as a textbook in Oxford. More marvelous still, his books began after 1870 to bring him returns that made him financially secure. In some cases, admirers sent him substantial gifts, which he always returned. When Tsar Alexander II visited London and expressed to Lord Derby a desire to meet the distinguished sovereign of England, Derby invited Spencer, Huxley, Tyndall, etc., the others attended attended, but Spencer declined. He associated with only a few intimates. No man is equal to his book, he wrote. All the best products of his mental activity go into his book, where they come separated from the mass of interior products with which they are mingled in his daily talk. When people insisted on coming to see him, he inserted stopping into his ears and listened placidly to their conversation. Strange to say, his fame vanished almost as suddenly as it had come. He outlived the height of his own repute and was saddened in his last years by seeing what little power his tirades had to stop the tide of paternalistic legislation. He had become unpopular with almost every class. Scientific specialists whose privileged fields he had invaded damned him with faint praise, ignoring his contributions and emphasizing his errors, and the bishops of all creeds united in consigning him to an eternity of punishment. Liberates who liked his denunciation of war turned from him in anger when he spoke his mind on socialism and on trade union politics, while conservatives who liked his views on socialism shunned him because of his agnosticism. I am more Tory than any Tory, and more radical than any radical, he said. Wistfully, he was incorrigibly sincere and offended every group by speaking candidly on every subject. After sympathizing with the workers as victims of their employers, he added that the workers would be as domineering if positions were reversed. And after sympathizing with women as victims of men, he did not fail to add that men were the victims of women so far as the women could manage it. He grew old alone. As he aged, he became more gentle in opposition and more moderate in opinion. He had always laughed at England's ornamental king, but now he expressed the view that it was no more right to deprive the people of their king than it was to deprive a child of its doll. So, in religion, he felt it absurd and unkind to disturb the traditional faith where it seemed a beneficent and cheering influence. He began to realize that religious beliefs and political movements are built upon needs and impulses beyond the reach of intellectual attack. and he reconciled himself to seeing the world roll on without much heeding the heavy books he hurled in its direction. Looking back over his arduous career, he thought himself foolish for having sought literary fame instead of the simpler pleasures of life. When he died in 1903, he had come to think that his work had been done in vain. We know now, of course, that it was not so. The decay of his repute was part of the English Hegelian reaction against positivism. The revival of liberalism will raise him again to his place as the greatest English philosopher of his century. He gave to philosophy a new contact with things and brought to it a realism which made German philosophy seem, beside it, weakly pale and timidly abstract. He summed up his age as no man had ever summed up any age since Dante, and he accomplished so masterly a coordination of so vast an area of knowledge that criticism is almost shamed into silence by his achievement. We are standing now on heights which his struggles and his labors won for us. We seem to be above him because he has raised us on his shoulders. Some day, when the sting of his opposition is forgotten, we shall do him better justice. Today's work is over.